Afternoon. How are you? It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to come and spend an hour or so with you talking about influence and persuasion. What I'd like to ideally persuade you is that influence is actually a science. It's not necessarily something that a lucky few are born with. What I'd like to be able to do over the next hour or so is point to a large body of evidence, some 60 years of scientific inquiry into what causes people to be persuaded by the requests you make, whether those are requests in your business settings, with your colleagues, your bosses, the people that work for you, or whether those influence settings are perhaps a little closer to home, persuading your spouse, your partner, your children to do what you want them to do. There is, I think, a very good case to be made that anyone can be more effective, can be a much more productive influencer and persuader by following just a set of basic rules of the influence and persuasion process. Now, some of these rules, some of these principles are counterintuitive. I think it's the case that what we sometimes believe will influence and persuade people is very different to the realities of what actually does influence and persuade people. And so one of the things I'm keen to do this afternoon is share with you some examples of those counterintuitive moments. But rather than just talk about the evidence, I'd also like to talk about the practicalities of influence and persuasion. How can we take some of the insights that this body of research provides us with and make meaningful applications so that when you leave here this afternoon, you go back to your offices, you go back to your work environments, you have some practical tips, some techniques, some things that you can take away and apply to make you a more effective, more influential, more persuasive communicator. Sound okay with you? Okay, right. Well, the first thing to talk about in this journey of social influence is that some of this evidence is actually a little uncomfortable. It turns out that whilst we like to think that we know what guides our behavior, why we do the things we do, it actually turns out that there are other things at play that cause us to behave the way that we do. In fact, whilst most people think that a good way to influence people is to give people more information, to educate them, to provide them with all the data so that they can come to a rational decision about what the right thing to do is. And I'm not saying that people are not rational. But what I am saying is that in the overwhelming majority of cases, the environment and the context in which we find ourselves in shapes our behavior perhaps more than anything else. Information, education, providing people with data isn't an especially good mechanism for influence and persuasion, for getting people to pay attention, for getting people to change. Perhaps one of the reasons for that is that we live in the most information-overloaded, stimulus-saturated environment that's ever existed on this planet. The average UK citizen today is exposed to somewhere in the region of about 2,000 overt attempts each day to influence and persuade their thinking. And your important messages, your important requests and proposals will form part of that 2,000. So the question is, how do you ensure that your important messages, your important requests rise above this sea of other competing information? And it's here where I think this evidence comes into its own. Information alone isn't an especially good mechanism for influence and persuasion. But information in a particular context can be a remarkably effective mechanism for getting people to change. And it's these contexts that I'd like to speak about today. Whilst there are perhaps many thousands of different ways in which we might create an individual technique or strategy to influence people, the overwhelming majority of the most successful ones fall into one of just 6 universal contexts or principles of influence, if you like.